This is Gnadenhutten. This place is the scene of one of the most horrific massacres that took place in American history. The year was 1782. Indian converts from the Delaware tribe had come here to live under the leadership of David Zeisberger. Zeisberger was a European who had left Europe because of persecution years before, had moved to Pennsylvania, and then ultimately, because a Delaware chief had invited him to come into this area, he came and founded several Christian, Indian, Moravian settlements. Gnadenhutten was one of them. Just a few miles down the road from Schönbrunn, another one that Zeisberger had worked at. The Indians that were living here were pacifists. They didn't want to get involved in the political turmoil between the British and the Americans that was taking place. The wars between the Indians and the colonists and the Americans, they wanted nothing to do with. They just wanted to live here in peace. When Zeisberger came in 1772, 10 years prior to this massacre, he came with about 100 of these Delawares. But they spread the gospel, and soon there were about 400 of them living in these three villages. Because they were neutral in the struggle between the British and the Americans, and between the Indians and the Europeans, they were suspected by both sides. And eventually the British came down from Detroit, and the Indians that were working with them, between those Indians and the British, they forced the Moravians to leave here, and they had to go live in some settlements up close to Sandusky, north and west of here. But that particular winter, the winter of 1781 and 82, they were living in just little huts that they had to, I guess, put together quickly. They had no food, they were starving. And so about 120 of them came back here to Gnadenhutten because they had planted corn the year before in the fall, and it was ready to be harvested, and they desperately needed that food. So they came, and they were out here on the other side of the Tuscarawas River, and they were harvesting their food when about 100 militia members of a militia from over in what we would call Washington County today in Pennsylvania came across the Ohio River, and many of these militia members had had family members who had been killed by Indians, or their neighbors had been, and they were very angry, very upset, and they were ready to kill any Indians that they could. They came here to Gnadenhutten at just the time when these Indians had come back, these Delaware Christians had come back to harvest their corn and take it back and save the lives of their fellow Christians. Well, the sad thing is that they came into this village, well, they found the Indians out there in the fields, and they came and made them believe that they were peaceful and that they were here to protect these Indians and actually take them back to Fort Pitt and take them out of the kind of the hot spot here, the danger zone. The Indians believed them. They were actually happy to see the Americans. They came back here into the village. But what the Indians didn't know is that a mile before they got here, the militia members, they had found a little boy out in the woods that had wandered a little bit away from the arrest, and they shot him. One of the members of the militia shot him. There were about 100 of them. They shot the boy. The boy was pleading for his life when a guy by the name of Bilderbeck walked up to him and hatcheted, just split his skull open and killed him. Then they came the rest of the way, met these Indians, brought them back to the village, then surrounded them and let them know that they weren't here on peaceful terms at all. They took the men and the women and separated them. Now there were about 30 children, 35 children, maybe about 30 men and 30 women. They put the men over there in the Cooper cabin, locked them up in there, and they locked the women and children in the mission house here where they had religious services. I want to take you into the mission house. these are reconstructed buildings on the very spots where the original cabins were and the mission house. So they brought them in, and they finally let them know that they were going to kill them. And the Moravian Christians were stunned. They hadn't done a thing. Abraham was an elder Indian that was their leader, and he said, you know, we're not guilty of anything. We haven't done anything. But these men were filled with such wrath and hatred, and they wanted revenge, and it really didn't matter who they were killing. As long as they were an Indian, they were ready to kill them. So they let them know, well, Abraham, that they were going to kill them, and Abraham asked the Colonel John Williamson, who was their leader, if they would be able to have the night before they were killed. They would at least be able to spend the night together. So the women and children were in here, the men were over there, and they spent all night singing, praying. Some of them made little apologies to each other. If there were any hard feelings. They were preparing themselves for the next world. The next morning, the militia got up. They met out here outside, and they decided to cast lots. One historian said, who would have the privilege to kill the first Indians? Well, the lot fell on a guy by the name of Bilderbeck. He's the guy that had shot the boy out in the woods. He picked up a mallet, a big mallet, wooden mallet. He drug Abraham outside and took that mallet and crushed the back of his head. Then he came in, and they had the Indians lined up against the wall, with their hands bound. And he began to crush one skull after another until there were 13 of them down. Then he handed the mallet off to another man and said, I've done a good job here, but my arms are tired, you take over. And then he scalped all 13 of those men he had killed. Well, they went around until all the men were laying in a heap, pile of blood. The same thing happened with the women and the children. Same horrible ending to all of them. Except there were two little boys that escaped. One boy had hidden under the floorboards. They had a basement of some kind down below, and blood was running down to him, and he could hear what was going on. But after it was over, he escaped. Another boy, they'd mallet him in the back of the head, thought they'd killed him, and scalped him, and he was down below, he was buried among the body of men, and he came to and fled. And those two boys met up and went all the way to Sandusky and told the terrible news to David Zeisberger, who was back there with the Moravians. Zeisberger was devastated. I mean, it was his own countrymen. You know, the Indians thought if they accepted this faith, this Christian faith, that at least they'd be saved from the very people that had come from Europe, some to spread the gospel, others just to take their lands. But still they thought they'd be safe, but they weren't. What a tragedy to have pacifists, Delaware Christian Indians who had converted to the Moravian faith, who were pacifists. They were neutral in all of these battles that were going on around them, warfare, that they would die at the hands of Americans. And of course, Zeisberger was a long time getting over what happened. He came back into the area eventually and built another settlement called Goshen, and he's buried there. He spent 60 years working with these Indians in this area, Pennsylvania, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and even up into what we call Michigan and Canada today. A man of God that God used. Theodore Roosevelt, 120 years after this event, said that this was a stain on the frontier history of America, and that it was a stain that the passing of time could never wipe away. Christians come back to this spot even today. Once a month, Christians from around Ohio come here to this reconstructed chapel and worship the Lord here in memory of these Christians who lost their lives. I was here yesterday, and there was a group of Christians here from around the state worshiping the Lord and remembering continuing to remember what took place in this spot called Gnadenhutten.